Coming up next on KPBS Evening Edition, the court-martial of a San Diego Marine sheds light into just how different military justice may be from civilian life.
And San Diego researchers make some interesting discoveries about women's sexual health over 40. KPBS Evening Edition starts now.
Hello, thanks for joining us. I'm Joanne Ferrian.
And I'm Dwayne Brown. The city of San Diego has taken its first step toward unraveling its redevelopment agencies.
The state has said that redevelopment agencies must be dissolved by February 1st. And now the city council has voted to have San Diego take over as the successor agency, overseeing the completion of projects already in the works. How that will work is still being determined. City leaders say they will still try to resurrect some form of redevelopment.
San Diego City Council is putting a new emphasis on bringing more jobs to town. Today, the council created a new committee to work on job creation. It will focus on topics ranging from worker education to attracting and retaining businesses.
District Attorney Bonnie Dumanis says if she's elected mayor, she'll donate her salary to city education programs. That's more than $100,000 per year minus taxes. She's also pledging not to take a city pension, but she will still be eligible to collect a county pension.
County supervisors are hearing appeals this week from property owners in the rural backcountry. Many of them are unhappy with the county's new general plan. The plan downzones many properties, reducing the number of homes that can be built on the land. The plan, more than a decade in the works, was approved last year. The San Onofre nuclear power plant is getting an upgrade. One of its generating units was taken offline last night. They're replacing its reactor heads and turbines to make the plant safer for workers and help produce more power. The work on Unit 2 will take about 2 months. Unit 3 will get the same treatment in the fall. The court-martial of a Camp Pendleton staff sergeant resumed today. Joanne and her guest are talking about the difference between military and civilian justice over at the KPBS Evening Edition Roundtable.
Staff Sergeant Frank Woodridge is the last Marine to be tried in the Haditha killings. 24 Iraqis, including 11 women and children, were killed by American troops in November 2005. An investigation into the killings was delayed and not pursued until this video and questions from a Time magazine reporter were presented to military officials. While many of the facts of the case have been established, whether the Marines were justified in their actions will determine not just the fate of Frank Woodridge, but could impact future relations between the U.S. and Iraq. Joining me now is retired Brigadier General David Brahms. He served in the United States Marine Corps for nearly 26 years and is a practicing military attorney with an office in Carlsbad. General, thank you for being here.
Thank you for having me.
I mentioned that many of the facts of the case have been established. We know that this squad was hit by an explosive device, an IED. One of their own men was killed. Then the squad was led to a couple of nearby homes to clear the houses. On the way, they stopped a vehicle. We know that 5 men were killed, many of them shot in the back, and that in these homes, women and children, unarmed, were killed. How does one then mount a defense when you have facts like those staring you in the face? How does one then mount a defense against all of this?
Oh, we start with the fact that your premise is wrong. We don't know all of the facts, relevant facts, very pertinent to mounting a defense. We don't know what was in Frank Woodridge's mind. We don't know the direction that he got from his senior. We do not know what training he had. We do not know what he observed or heard. For example, one of the sounds supposedly heard by Woodridge as he came upon the entrance to the room in the first house was the sound of an AK-47 rifle being racked, meaning there was something behind the door that could kill him. That is a stimulus for his response. Kick in the door in accordance with your training. Throw in a grenade, follow, as that training indicates, with superior force to preclude getting hurt, to preclude any problems.
Is this the fundamental difference in terms of how civilians may see this this scene of events or this incident or justice and how someone in the military perceives it? Does this sort of go to the heart of rules of engagement?
Military actions are governed by a lot of things, starting with international law, which establishes the rules of war, our own internal national laws, and then the rules of engagement. All of these establish boundaries for behavior. In the craziness of a war setting, these boundaries provide guidance. Don't use deadly force unless you can identify someone who is hostile. You can identify a hostile situation. Try to imagine being in a setting in a foreign country with people shooting at you with intelligence information, part of the information which you didn't present. It's indicated that this town is hostile. But there's just been an explosion, which is likely a command-detonated explosion, which means someone had to have a visual vantage point from where they were to the place where the IED, improvised explosive device, went off. Logically, wouldn't you look to find some place where that person might have been standing?
But we also know that that Frank Wuterich was young at the time, 25. This was his first time in combat. That these decisions were made in the heat of the moment. They had just seen one of their own men killed. Is there not, even given all of that, is there ever culpability, though, in terms of maybe making those decisions too quickly, maybe not being experienced enough to make those decisions?
Culpability generally comes as a result of some intentional bad act, where it's not a question of making a judgment call. It's a question of you lose control of yourself or your mind. You react, as the government has suggested in the past in this case, you react from anger. My good friend, my dear friend, my brother was blown up when there's charred remains at the side of the road. I'm going to get those bastards. I don't think that's what happened here, but if that had happened, then there's no doubt that there should be accountability.
I mentioned in the beginning of this segment about the relationship between Iraq and the U.S., and the reason I did so, that the Washington Post reported just a few months back that one of the reasons troops had withdrawn entirely out of Iraq is because the two governments couldn't come to an agreement with regard to immunity, and they pointed to this case as an example. Do you think the outcome of this case could impact the future relationship between the U.S. government and Iraq?
Absolutely not. I think people will posture and rattle their swords with regard to it. But this is but one vignette in a long war, almost 9 years of war. There have been many of these kinds of vignettes where unfortunate results occur. Unfortunate result is not equivalent to criminal behavior. Unfortunate result is an occasion to look back and say, what could we do that is different, if anything, to avoid this unfortunate result? You can't reason back from unfortunate result to this person needs to be locked up.
General Brahms, thank you so much for being here.
My pleasure. Thank you.
Researchers at UC San Diego have some surprising findings about women's sexuality. We'll talk with one of those researchers in just a moment. And tourism is on the rebound in San Diego, what officials are projecting for this year. Coming up, this is KPBS Evening Edition.
Tonight on KPBS at 8, from W.C. Fields to Larry David, a look at the wise guy who speaks the truth no matter the consequences. On Make 'em Laugh, the funny business of America. Then at 9, he was an outlaw with a deadly reputation at the tender young age of 21. Now hear the real story of Billy the Kid on American Experience. And at 10, incisive documentaries covering the scope and complexity of the human experience. Join us for Frontline. That's tonight on KPBS.
I'm Judy Woodruff. On the next News Hour, voters in New Hampshire cast ballots in the first primary of this election year. That's Tuesday on the PBS News Hour.
The American people have named PBS
the most trusted source of news
and public affairs
for the 8th year in a row.
Trust.
The American people have spoken.
Thank you.
KPBS Evening Edition is made possible by Joan and Irwin Jacobs and by
Yesterday, we told you a small drop in gas prices would probably be temporary. It lasted just a day. Prices started going back up this morning. Oil analysts say retailers are still catching up to the higher costs. Well, tourism is making a comeback in San Diego after a 3-year slump. It is the third largest industry in the county, behind military and manufacturing. Tourism employs about 160,000 people, or 13% of the county's workforce.
Every time I come here, I wonder why anyone who lives here ever moves anywhere else.
Kirsten Oline is the director of meetings for the Association of Medical Colleges in Washington, D.C.
This daily sunshine is a huge part of it. People are happy here when they're attending the meeting.
She and about 4,000 other people from around the country are meeting at the San Diego Convention Center downtown. Half of them are in charge of deciding where their organizations will hold their next big conference.
We're an industry that really has to have people feel good about spending money.
Joe Terzi with the Convention and Visitors Bureau says the average tourist spends about $500 here, and that adds up to a nearly $8 billion boost a year for the local economy.
And frankly, we're excited about the fact that we had a good 2011 and 2012 is shaping up, and we're looking at anywhere between a 6 and 8% increase in the overall performance of tourism in San Diego, which is very, very positive.
Tourist attractions and great weather aren't the only things attracting visitors to San Diego. They also have a thirst for something else.
But the other thing that's happened is San Diego has quickly become known for the craft beer scene. And, we are probably between us and I'm thinking either Seattle or the Portland area up in the Pacific Northwest, really the hotbed for craft beers.
San Diego's tourism industry also generates lots of tax revenue. That money is used to help maintain police, fire, and maintenance, as well as parks and recreation. Comic-Con draws thousands of tourists to San Diego every summer. So many, the pop culture extravaganza always sells out. Last year, the convention's online registration system crashed because of the demand. This year, Comic-Con organizers are changing things. Starting today, attendees can get an online ID to buy a badge, but the badges are not on sale yet, and the Comic-Con folks aren't saying when they will be. San Diego scientists made headlines last week with a new study looking at women's sexuality. Joanne spoke with one of the researchers.
A San Diego research study has made some interesting discoveries when it comes to women's sexuality, in particular, women over 40. The UC San Diego study was published in the January edition of the American Journal of Medicine, and its conclusions may surprise you. Joining me is Dr. Susan Trompeter, Associate Clinical Professor in the Division of General Internal Medicine at UCSD School of Medicine. Dr. Trompeter, thanks for being here.
Thank you.
What did your study set out to do?
We set out to analyze sexual parameters in community-dwelling women, of which there was very little data that had been published. We used data from the Rancho Bernardo cohort, which is a group of people who were initially recruited between 1972 and 1974, interestingly via a trailer in the Safeway parking lot. Everybody in the community was invited to participate. A free exam and enrollment was done at that time, and this group of people has been followed for the last almost 40 years. We originally had about 6,600 people, and now there are maybe 1,400 remaining.
So you mentioned sexual parameters. So what did you ask these women in terms of this new study, these new findings?
We used something called the Female Sexual Function Index, FSFI. And it is a 19-question questionnaire. I have it here. It's quite extensive. But after demographic or information about their menopausal status and whether they were on hormone replacement therapy, we asked about sexual desire in all women, and then we asked whether women had engaged in sexual activity over the past month. And then if they had engaged in sexual activity, we proceeded to ask questions regarding sexual arousal, lubrication, orgasm. And then we also asked about emotional closeness during sexual activity, and we concluded with questions on sexual satisfaction.
So what did you learn? What was the big surprising thing that you learned after you gathered all of this?
Well, our data was very similar to other published data as far as sexual activity is concerned. 50% of the women reported sexual activity in the last month. Women, though, continue to be sexually active into older age, and they reported high levels of arousal, lubrication, and orgasm also into older age. And the oldest quartile were women over 80, and this was an interesting finding. We also found that despite this activity and these other levels, sexual desire was actually reported to be quite low in most of the women.
So they could have sexual satisfaction yet not have sexual desire.
Absolutely. Most of the women actually did not have much sexual desire. There was a higher incidence of sexual desire in the younger women, but that definitely seemed to decrease dramatically with age. But that did not seem to alter the sexual experience. And
isn't low sexual desires considered dysfunction for these women?
Well, originally, when research began pertaining to women's sexuality, 30 plus years ago, all women that had low sexual desire were categorized as having a sexual dysfunction. And then it wasn't until 2000 when the criteria for hypoactive sexual desire disorder changed to include personal distress. But by this time, there was kind of this inertia towards this problem that we had with women that had low sexual desire. Now, I will say there is a subgroup of women who have low sexual desire and are personally distressed by this, and this does seem to be focused primarily on the menopausal age range.
You also concluded something else that was really interesting, that these women were reporting that they had sexual satisfaction, but they didn't necessarily have sex.
Absolutely. We found a group of women that were very sexually satisfied without having sexual activity at all. And I think that group experienced satisfaction through other means, touching, caressing, sharing time together, intimacies that have developed over a course of a long relationship, perhaps.
So if your study contributes toward removing the idea of having distress because women have low sexual desire, what does that mean going forward? Does it mean that you take away sort of this label and women can have less stress even though they have low sexual desire and still be sexually satisfied?
Well, there are different models of sexuality that I think apply to different women. And while there is a linear model where women have sexual desire that goes on to arousal and et cetera, there is a significant group of women who have a healthy sexual experience without preceding sexual desire. They enter into a sexual activity because they want to keep their partner happy or because they want to nurture the relationship.
Great. Dr. Susan Trompeter, thanks for being here.
Absolutely. Thank you.
Chula Vista police are turning to wristwatch technology to try and keep seniors safe. The department is handing out special tracking bracelets to seniors with mental disabilities. The bracelets use cell phone technology to locate the wearer. Police say it can help them locate missing seniors quickly. We'll have a look at the history of free speech in San Diego in just a moment. This is KPBS Evening Edition.
The fabric of democracy, I think, really has worn very thin. The opposite of poverty is not wealth. The opposite of poverty is justice.
Americans have to fight for the American dream.
Democracy is not what governments do, it's what people do.
This is how we fight back.
Moyers and Company.
I'm Bill Moyers. Join me Friday nights at 10 on KPBS San Diego.
Tuesday at 10 on KPBS.
The next time you accuse someone of getting on their soapbox, you might want to think about the San Diego connection to that phrase. As Joanne's next guest explains, it can be traced back 100 years to the city center.
Imagine being told you don't have a right to free speech because a local ordinance bans you from speaking anywhere near the city center. This is not the story of Occupy San Diego, but a tale that goes back 100 years. This year marks the centennial of the San Diego free speech fight. Joining me to talk about the events that took place 100 years ago is Jim Miller, author of Flash, based on the San Diego free speech fight. He also teaches labor studies at San Diego City College. Thanks, Jim, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
Let's talk about this fight 100 years ago. Tell us more about it.
Well, what happened was members of the industrial workers of the world, of whom there were only 50 members at the time in San Diego in 1912, were using soapboxing, which is standing up on a soapbox and speaking to help organize workers in the Gaslamp, which was then the kind of multi-ethnic working class district of the San Diego. And this was such an irritant to John Spreckels and some of the city's elites that they decided to respond to it with an unprecedented action by banning, free speech and singing on soapboxes in downtown San Diego. Now, this was met with stiff resistance by the IWW, who then, resisted the ban, filled the jails, called 5,000 people into San Diego to help resist this. And the response to that was a wave of vigilante terror, where you had events like when Emma Goldman came to San Diego with her partner, Ben Reitman, and he was kidnapped from the U.S. Grant Hotel, driven to Penasquitos, forced to run a gauntlet, tortured, tarred and feathered, and driven north to Los Angeles and told never to come back to San Diego. And there were people killed in jail during this period.
That's what seems so surprising. There was so much violence, right? There was a lot of violence. Isn't that what attracted such national attention to San Diego's fight?
Right. Because you could say, in some regard, maybe they could have just ignored the IWW. It wasn't a large organization at the time, but I think it was a kind of almost hysterical reaction of the powers that be in San Diego that had this both national but also international response to the events in San Diego. Because people who maybe didn't necessarily agree with the politics of the IWW said, well, if you can do this to them, you can do it to me. So if I'm a preacher who wants to preach on the street corner, or somebody who's a member of another political organization who thinks you've got the right to public assembly, those rights were at stake too in the midst of this assault on the IWW.
So how long did it take for them to win the right to free speech, to overturn this ordinance?
Well, it was a long struggle. I mean, the violence, the vigilante terror went on for months, and it wasn't until 1915 when the ban was eventually overturned. So this was not a quick incident in the history of San Diego, but eventually, those rights to picket, to public assembly, to speak in public were eventually restored. But I think the lesson of this is that anybody who enjoys those rights today needs to remember that they can and have been taken away, and it's important that people fight to maintain those rights.
We haven't got a lot of time, but is there something we can take away with the Occupy San Diego demonstration as well, with knowing this history?
Yeah, I think that it's a good example of another generation of people insisting on public assembly and free speech rights. And even if you don't necessarily agree with Occupy, I think it's important that all Americans respect those rights.
Before we go, Jim, tell us that there's going to be a number of events celebrating this anniversary. Tell us how people can find out more about these events.
Well, you can go to AFT guild.org, and there is a site that has original historical documents, a photo gallery, and an events page. We're going to be having an event at City College on January 26th at 7 o'clock. There'll be a big event sponsored by the Labor Council on February 8th in downtown San Diego at 5th and E. So if you go to the website, you can find out more about those and other events.
And people at home, I want to let you know they can also go to our website, kpbs.org. We've got links to all of these things. Jim Miller, thank you so much for being here.
Great, thank you.
And now, time for our own soapbox, the public square. An update today on Governor Jerry Brown's tax initiative. According to the Nonpartisan Legislative Analyst's Office, the temporary tax hike would only raise about $5 billion in extra revenue, not $7 billion as the governor first stated. Now, some of you at home had your own questions about the governor's plan. Selma in Rancho Santa Fe says, I'm sure I speak for most San Diego taxpayers when I say that we don't mind helping to clear the $4 to $5 billion deficit rather than see further cuts to our children's education once more. However, we need to know if this will be a once-off tax, and if so, how much on average this would mean to us in dollar terms. Well, Selma, we can tell you the tax hike, if approved, is supposed to expire after 5 years. As far as how much that will cost you, well, that depends on how much you buy, because you will pay more in sales tax. Now, in terms of how much you earn, that will determine how much more you pay in income tax. If you earn $250,000 or less, your taxes probably won't be affected. Now, tomorrow, I will be interviewing NPR CEO Gary Now. What would you like me to ask him? If you have a question or a comment, write to me, jfarian@kpbs.org, or follow us on Twitter, or if you really like us, then please do so on Facebook. Now, let's go back to Dwayne at the news desk for a recap of today's stories.
The city of San Diego will take over projects overseen by local redevelopment agencies. The agencies are being dissolved by the state on the 1st of February. And county supervisors are hearing appeals from backcountry landowners about its new general plan. The plan downzones many properties, limiting their development potential, and the owners say that reduces their property values. You can watch and comment on any of the stories you saw tonight on our website, kpbs.org/evening edition. Thanks for joining us. You have a great night. We leave you with a look at the cooler forecast.